before I get too far into this here, how many of you guys are familiar with CMAF and know what CMAF is in CMAF, the low latency context? No? Well, I guess probably good to make sure we get a little bit of established background on what that is then. So CMAF, which is, of course, yet another acronym for Common Multimedia Application Format. Essentially what this is a definition for using kind of a common way to have the same set of underlying files that would let you provide both HLS and Dash compatible streams. So you just have that same encode of, for instance, H.264 or HEVC or whatever the case might be. And then you can have your different manifests, an HLS manifest, a Dash manifest referencing it. The particular technology that we're going to talk about today here, though, CMAF low latency, so far is only available in Dash scenarios. There's some work that's going on around that to potentially bring that to HLS, but of course that's dependent upon Apple ratification and so on. So we're talking about this today within the confines of Dash use cases, which is primarily your devices like your Android, your Chrome browsers, quite a number of smart TVs and so on. So just so that we have that background going on there. This is kind of a CMAF workflow. As you can see, it's quite convoluted. But we'll go through the details of this. We'll start explaining what these different components are, what their impact is on latency, and really kind of actually start at defining latency first before we go exactly what we're doing to this that makes it low latency. So a good place to start with this is first off defining what our latency is. And there's a lot of variation interpretations on this, so we've got kind of a little spectrum here, a sliding scale of different latency scenarios here. So starting all the way down at the far end there, we have high latency. So this would be kind of what we see in the early, yes?
Do you have this online?
We'll be posting this online afterwards. So I'll also be doing questions at the end too. I mean, please, if you have it, you can cover it then. So, but anyway, starting down there, high latency. So this is your kind of earlier days of streaming. These are, you have to download a large number of segments, for instance, before you can start streaming. We see typical latency there being in the 60 plus range seconds. Moving on forward from that, we have sort of more modern latencies with HLS typical latency. In the earlier days of this was actually defined by the Apple spec, where it said you had to have 3 segments that were 10 seconds apiece. So that had to be content that was actually on the user's device. So that added a whole lot of latency right there. So that's kind of the earlier latency scenarios. And we start to move that down further and further. We get down into some of the implementations that we see on technologies like smooth streaming, HDS, and Dash, where you can start using smaller segments. And actually, HLS now does let you use smaller segments. People are doing that in market. But those start to hit their limits around these kind of what we have this reduced latency section here, which is really where we're starting to push those conventional technologies as far as they can go without having to modify them a little bit. The low latency that we're talking about for the purposes of this show, or this presentation today, is right around this 5-second mark here. This is that what's possible with the CMAF low latency technologies. And then beyond that, there are some technologies that are starting to appear in the market, and there's some other types of technologies that get you lower latency than that even, when we see the second or sub-second latency. The thing about these technologies is that they're very difficult to apply for the kind of scenarios that, for instance, sports broadcasters like to use, because these technologies, like WebRTC, for example, only work the way they do because they're able to communicate directly from one person to one person, or from a very small number, or from one person rather to a very small number of people. They don't have the ability to address large audiences through something like a CDN, for example, that the higher latency technologies that we're talking about use. Yes? Small number of people, so usually there are some companies that have done some interesting, innovative solutions to address larger groups of people, but generally speaking, you're talking about maybe a dozen or so people at a time, something like this. It's a technology that's really applicable for a teleconferencing solution or something like that. It's not something, though, where you can really effectively get large audiences. Now, that's not to say that people aren't necessarily using it that way, but for the most part, it doesn't scale very effectively. You run into infrastructure challenges and distribution challenges and buffering challenges and so forth when you try and get to those larger audience segments like that. But anyway, we're talking about that 5-second target latency today because this is an area we're able to start applying some of the technologies that we have already in place with traditional CDN distribution, but how we can modify them, modify the way that they're used to get that latency down much lower. So that's that 5-second or so mark that we're looking at there. So why is latency higher with earlier technologies or other technologies? So what we have here is the live feed. In this case, this is going to be your live event, like a sporting event or news or whatever that case might be. That has to go to an encoder. The encoder then has to go create these segments. In order to effectively utilize CDN technologies, what they'll do is they'll make the individual files, those what people have been familiar with, the transport stream segments or now fragmented MP4 segments. Those get generated and they get put on an origin server. That origin server then has a CDN in front of it. This is where those segments are going to be delivered to before those get requested by the end user who's using a player, for instance, or a set-top box or something like that, that's going to be pulling those from the CDN there. Each one of these steps, because, for example, they have to have a complete file, those complete segments, they need to transfer that segment at a whole. So you have those units of granularity that are so big, they are these days we get maybe 2 seconds or so out of an HLS segment, but as I was mentioning earlier segment sizes could be as high as 10 seconds in the earlier days of HLS, for example. Then encoding. Encoding also has its own set of components to latency here. So for instance, we have a video ingest. This is typically a very short process, but this would be the SDI, for example, going from your camera into your encoder. Then you have video processing that has to happen to that. Those could be things like denoising filters, it could be scaling, it could be any one number of effects, all the processing, for instance, lower thirds, all those kind of things that might also happen in there as well. And then there's the video compression process. So taking that very large piece of video, that uncompressed video from an SDI spigot or something like that, and squeezing that down to a modern codec like H.264, now HEVC VP9, and so on. And then you have the OTT packager. This takes that encoded video and it converts it into those little file bits, those transport stream segments or those fragmented MP4 segments. Again, this is another step that adds in some delay for that. And as we were mentioning, those can be, for instance, 2 seconds, 6 seconds, 10 seconds individual files that are then played out in a series to create that smooth playback experience. But as you can see here, we can see delays like 2 to 5 seconds just from that processing level, and then another delay of about 6 seconds for those files themselves. The next step in creating the latency that we have is the player side. So this is where we're getting those segments. We've got them from the CDN, which has its own set of delays to it. And it has to build up a buffer. So it has to have a certain amount of those segments on hand before it can start playing those back. Earlier implementations of this usually had 2 to 3 segments. As I was mentioned, the Apple HLS standard originally required those 3 segments. So that's files that you have to have before you can actually start playing back that video at all. So again, another level of delay that we get from that. And that then adds 20 to 40 seconds of buffer in this case. So you're getting quite another set of delay here. So the big reason why this is such a problem is when we're looking at it, it's those files that we have, those segments that are fully contained pieces of video. And this is what it looks like with a traditional segment here. You can see on top, there's this part of that segment that's called the MOOF. This has essentially metadata, describes what the video is, basically where the video starts in the file, where it ends, what that video looks like, and so on. Because that's one whole component in that segment, you have to get that whole segment to the player before that player can start playing that back. What we're doing here with CMAF low latency is we're actually taking, instead of having that file have one huge single piece of MOOF data in it, or that MDAT rather, which is actually the video itself, we're dividing that up into much smaller components. So even though we have one file, in that single file itself, there are effectively multiple small self-contained files. I'm sure most of you guys are familiar with GOP structure. Essentially, what we've gone here is from having maybe a couple of GOPs in that one single large MDAT to we can get down as far now is one GOP down to each one of the separate MDATs that we have there inside of that single, in this case, fragmented MP4 segment. In this case here, we also have the dash manifest where we can show you what we have, the availability offset. I'm going to get to that in a little bit more when we talk about what we call target latency and low latency here. So this is what we have now with a CMAF low latency stream here. You can see we have the live feed. We have the encoder generating these segments. You can see these segments here are shown by these numbers 1 through 5 at the top there. And then inside of those segments, we have representing the different MDAT boxes that we've created with the AB, ABC, et cetera. So what this means is, what you can see here, we've got those segments we've created. Live has already happened for segments 1 through 4 in this case. Now we're on segment 5. As you can see, segment 5 has already written ABC. The player has done something through the CDN called chunk-based transferring. This is a technology that's only possible with HTTP 1.1 CDNs. So this is another component in this workflow that we'll get into when we get to the kind of whole set of challenge that we have here, where it has to have it has to be able to ask for only part of that segment. So in this case, instead of getting that whole segment as a single file as we do with many conventional CDNs, we're saying, I want this segment, but I only want the first part of it up to maybe the third of that segment. And that set of bits are what I'm going to get delivered to the player. That player then, now because it has that self-contained GOP within each one of those MDAT boxes, is now able to start leveraging, playing that back, attaching that to the buffer in the player, and start showing you video before it's actually fully downloaded the entire segment itself. And this is what's called the chunk-based transfer, because it's only transferring a chunk of that actual file as opposed to the whole file together. So let's take a look at the breakdown of the architecture here. So this is where we're talking about the segment loader here in the player. Now it's loading those chunks, so as opposed to the fully formed segments that I mentioned. This does require some technology in the browser, specifically what's called the fetch API. This is basically a way of getting the segments, a way of transferring those from the CDN with a HTTP 1.1 chunk-based transfer. It's not available in all browsers. It's really only available in the most modern browsers, and even modern browsers don't necessarily have this functionality enabled, so this is one of the other challenges that we run into with this technology. There's also what we call the latency controller. So what you might have seen earlier, I mentioned that we're going to cover, was the delay that we have here. This is the latency controller is pulling out that information, and it's using that to try and get that ideal latency that it's targeted, and this is something I'm going to get to again in a minute. We also have to measure the consistency of that playback. We have to make sure those buffers are preserved so that you're always getting a stable stream. We're not seeing people get interrupted around that. We're not seeing the player pause and so forth. And then we also have to, well, we're going to get to that in a moment, manipulating the playback speed, and then we decode that. So the main thing that we have here with the metadata is also that we're not able to necessarily dial in precisely a consistent experience for everybody using this playback technology. So that's what that target latency that we had from the previous slide was. This is what we're trying to achieve with our audience. It knows that there's a certain offset from it. And we're going to use that to inform the player that says we have 5 seconds or 6 seconds is our optimal latency that we can trust that we're going to be able to deliver to the player, because not everybody is going to have a fast enough connection to go download that. Different connections are going to have different speeds. So this is what we think is the most optimal way that we can reliably deliver that stream to the end user there. And then by balancing that out with the buffer level and measuring that analytically, we can then hopefully get this dialed into a consistent experience for all users. Now, as I mentioned at the top, this is a very new technology, and it's loaded with limitations and challenges. So I think an important thing to have for some context on this is not a technology that's really out there in the market yet, and there's still a lot of things that we need to determine about it. So there is, for example, no ABR yet available with low latency CMAF. Now, one of the reasons for this is that traditional ABR algorithms are based off of looking at how fast you can download a segment. And then you measure that time and you estimate the bandwidth based upon how fast that segment is, how fast that segment's been downloaded. Now, the problem with this in low latency CMAF is that that segment hasn't been fully written yet. We're already downloading that before that segment is written. And that means that we can have delays in that download that aren't a result of that user's connection. So we might be waiting for that segment to be written, even though we've already downloaded everything that's already been written. We have plenty of bandwidth overhead, and that then interferes with any of the conventional algorithms that have been used to determine how fast that user's connection is and how aggressively it can try and either adapt up or adapt down in the bitrate ladder. There are also challenges around that target latency that I was mentioning. There are some unknowns in the user experience that you get as a result of that, because the trick that's used by the player to achieve that target latency is by very subtly, or sometimes not so subtly, speeding up or slowing down the video to try and get to that threshold. So in fact, when you're playing this back, you may see people talk really fast for some reason, or you might see them slow down. And that's because the player is actually trying to get to that target latency so you have a consistent experience. And I think it's actually worth keeping in mind that the big deal of low latency isn't so much that I've seen something before somebody else, but it's my neighbor hasn't cheered for the touchdown or for the goal that's ruined my watching experience. By having that target latency be consistent, everybody sees that, that goal, that touchdown, that major event or whatever at that same time, and that's what then has that kind of consistent user experience. You don't know that, for example, that sporting event has happened somewhere that you can't see it as long as your neighbor hasn't spoiled that for you. Other challenges that we have too, as I mentioned earlier, this is only applicable in the Dash world at the moment. What Apple's going to do with low latency has yet to be seen. There have been some people, Twitter and their Periscope team in particular, have done some really innovative work around essentially this technology, but they've kind of shoehorned it in on their own. Apple has not officially announced support for any standards, so really the only option if you want to do this on an Apple device is to essentially use your own player framework. We've seen some weirdness in user experiences with this. Not necessarily our customer here, but Twitter went off and tried to implement this. Twitch rather implemented this themselves. Twitch, as most of you probably know, is an esports streaming platform. Their audience is often very concerned about low latency and other aspects of the experience like that. They implemented this technology and they got quite a bit of negative feedback from their audience around it. Mostly stuff around the kind of weirdness that you get in the audio when you speed up and slow down this audio to try and achieve that target latency. Then there's also the risk of buffering. As I mentioned, we don't really know what the most appropriate buffer logic is to adapt those streams. So right now, the closest thing that we have to a solution for this is a single bitrate stream that everybody gets. Of course, everybody's connection varies. So then what happens when you're trying to deliver that same stream? How do you pick what the best stream is to go deliver to people when you don't know what their connection is, when you're trying to serve them with that single stream? And then drifting can occur during those delivery too if that user's connection isn't fast enough, and of course that creates conflicts with that speed up, that slow down logic during playback. So where we see this right now is we're really doing a lot of investment, a lot of research on trying to understand what the best way is to approach some of these challenges, most notably around the adaptive bitrate logic. So how do we achieve a lot of the same expectations that our audience has today with the reliability of streaming that they get from a good ABR algorithm, but doing that in a way that also lets us achieve the same low latency goals. So that's still an area that there's a lot of research that's going on in. Then the other thing that's really important here is collecting data and really understanding what your end user experience is like from this, because this technology is so new that we don't yet know what that real world impact of trying to be so aggressive with those low buffers are. It's very difficult to test this too, because there aren't many streams available that really showcase this, and you have to do it with a real live stream to see the kind of impacts, the kind of nuances of it, because if you're doing this, for instance, with a simulated stream, that simulated stream won't necessarily have the real world variability that you get from an encoder that's still writing out those segments to it. So quite a number of challenges still yet to address. We're going to continue researching on this. There's of course many other video players, video encoders, competitors in the market that are all trying to push this technology forward. It does have a lot of promise in it, but there's still quite a bit yet to be done, yet to be seen what the real world impact of that is. And on that note, I open it up to, I'm sure, questions.
Okay, very good. Round of applause for our speaker. Okay, who's got a question? Oh, we got a question over here.
He was ready to go the whole show.
Yep, he's been raring. All right, Emir?
Thanks. Hey, so earplugs and turning off Twitter still a best solution to...
I mean, for so many things, I'm sure many therapists would say that too.
Yeah, on one of your first slides, you showed the difference between the standard FMP4 and CMAF. I believe you said that the CMAF will have GOP in every...
I mean, that's a potential implementation for it. That's not a hard and fast implementation. That's basically as far down as we can go, though, because you do have to have a complete GOP structure delivered to the buffer.
My concern would be if IDR frames would just make this whole thing too large?
I mean, you do have a lot of consequence to that. You certainly don't get the efficiency that you get with other encoding solutions. For example, you can only use I and P frames. You can't use B frames at all. You don't have that bidirectional I frames anymore. So you're getting into earlier implementation of the codec then that don't get a lot of the modern advantage that we have.
Do we have one more? Okay, right here. Last one.
When you're chunkifying the data, do you have the ability to scale the size of those chunks so that you can play with it depending on the resolution or the data that you're trying to play with, or is it a fixed kind of packet size that you're dealing with?
Well, do you mean actually while a live encode is going on, or just in general? I mean, I would say in general, yes. When a live encode is going on, I would imagine that could be problematic. I don't think that we've experimented with that yet, but I could see that causing some issues.
Everyone, that is lunch. Thank you for being here. Another round of applause for our speaker.